Roast, Commissioner Beatty,
Here.
Mayor Boland. That concludes the Planning and Zoning Commission. On to the Architectural Review Board. Chair Dial.
Here.
Vice Chair Crow. Secretary Hinzik.
Here.
Member Hoffman.
Here.
Member Ritter. I see Mr. Ritter. Alternate Bartlesmeyer
Here.
and alternate Logia. And that concludes the Architectural Review Board.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Newberry. So I'll take just a couple seconds to just give a brief overview about the reason behind our combined meeting tonight. We're fortunate that myself and Mr. Beatty in place of Mr. Lee and Mr. Dial and Mr. Vunich were able to, and Ms. Arnett were able to have and Mr. Newberry were able to have a pre-meeting last week. And the rationale for why we're having this large meeting tonight, frankly, came out of our erosion task force because we think there's an opportunity where the architectural board and the planning and zoning groups, we have an opportunity where a lot of the building and construction and projects that are going to be approved by both of your boards certainly have direct impact upon erosion and flooding and watershed issues associated that we've seen so far in Wildwood. And we think there's an opportunity at least for us to work better together. And now that we're a newer task force over the last year, there may be an opportunity where we may want to consider other opportunities, including development of a liaison program between the three committees, evaluation of our current ordinances, and perhaps even development of even more stringent ordinances separate from what the county and state may require, so that we could hopefully get a handle upon the major problems we're seeing in our watersheds and the erosion problem that's unfortunately been worsening over the past couple of years. And so we thought that this could be a good entree in the three groups having a meeting tonight with some good examples by the city. And so that we could develop a dialogue for how do we move best forward with the three groups. And quite frankly, how can we get each of the three groups more engaged earlier on in the process before things are approved, so that we could understand upstream from approval process ways that we could mitigate some of the problems that we're seeing associated with erosion. So, Mr. Vunich, does that sound appropriate?
Yes, sir. Thank you. You did a nice job. I appreciate it.
And so with that, unless the other two committees or Mr. Archeski have anything to say, I think the next step would be if we want to move on to some of the presentation discussion of items that are included.
And to the chairs as well as to the other participants, obviously it's a large group tonight. So if you do have a comment or would like to make a suggestion or anything along those lines, we'd ask that you either use the raise hand feature or go into chat, and Mr. Newberry or Mr. Arnett will pick it up then and advise Dr. Remy of your request. I'm sure with this large of group, and since it's the first time that the group's gone on to double screens, we'll probably have a few hiccups along the way, but just bear with us. We'll make sure everybody that wants to talk can talk, and anybody that has a suggestion will be able to offer their suggestion. And I do want to apologize. There's a number of people that maybe you all don't recognize, maybe don't know. It's not the best forum to do introductions tonight. We also have the city administrator here with us. So it's not that we're ignoring you, and certainly don't appreciate your attendance. Like I say, it just probably would take us a half hour to go through the group. So maybe we could spend our time better. And then hopefully when we all get back in person, we'll have that opportunity to welcome you and show you that we're just not a face on the screen. So thank you. And Dr. Remy, with that, if it's with your permission, we'll proceed forward.
Absolutely, I appreciate that.
So just by the sheer number of people on the screen tonight, I think it provides an excellent example of how many people are involved in our processes. Just think of a simple application for, let's say, the use of a property in town center. How many people, as you see tonight, are involved in it at some point along its trip through the city's land use or development processes. So part of what we're trying to achieve tonight is just what you're seeing, that no person is an island in this process, and we all need everybody's help to make the project the best it can possibly be. Sometimes the Department of Planning has been criticized because it's got its nose in everything. And so one of the first things I wanted to talk about tonight is it's not that it's doing it because it's intentional or it thinks it knows better than others. Quite frankly, there are a number of requirements, both in our master plan and in state statute, that says the Planning and Zoning Commission and our other committees and boards and task force all have a role. And so sometimes when the Department of Planning is reminding people of that role, it may add time, it may slow the process, it could actually increase the cost of the project, but it's because, again, as a charter city with the master plan, state statute says that the Planning and Zoning Commission has to see all public projects. And as a corollary to that, it also says that any structure built in the city has to go before our Architectural Review Board. That's the local code component. And now finally, what we're finding with the Watershed Erosion Task Force, given the complexity of 9 watersheds and 67 square miles, at one time that task force was thought to be maybe a temporary effort that would identify the problems, create some solutions, and maybe just go away. I think as we've gone along, and I believe Dr. Remy and the other members of the task force will agree, it looks like it may have a permanent role in the future. Because every time we think we've got the watershed problems licked, so to speak, they come back with a ferocity that we didn't expect. And we're seeing that now. So I've done my disclaimer. It's not because we think we know better. It's not because we're nosy and curious and want to be a part of everything. It's because the charter, state statute, and local code say you all have to participate. And that's been memorialized in our master plan as well. It works well sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. And with Kathy or Travis sharing the screen, I just want to give you a couple of quick examples of what's worked well. Let's start off in a positive, and then I'll conclude my short presentation, and then we can maybe take some questions or comments. So the first set of slides, and there's just a few of them, so this won't take very long, is the second pedestrian bridge over State Route 100. This was a collaborative that brought almost every aspect of local government together. It started with city staff after getting direction from city council about wanting a second pedestrian bridge over Route 100, or down toward Route 109. The city staff began the preliminary work, but shortly thereafter, it went to the Architectural Review Board, the Planning and Zoning Commission, both committees of City Council, and then finally City Council. And along the way, we engaged residents as well to seek input on many of the design cues and the things that would provide the aesthetics. It was particularly important for the Canberry subdivision, which is on the south end of the bridge, that they have a role in it as well. And I think if you have taken the opportunity just to view the images, just some of the subtle things that were integrated into the center span to kind of draw attention to it in a kind of, I guess, less than flashy way, kind of indicates the role of the Architectural Review Board. You'll see the connectivity, which is the Planning and Zoning Commission. And ultimately, the amenities on either side were endorsed and advocated by City Council. So a good example. The next example, maybe from a planning and park side versus public works, is the Pavilion in Community Park. Again, another collaborative where almost every entity or authority in the city of Wildwood participated. The Pavilion gets rave reviews. Some of it came from our consultant, but I can attest to you that a lot of it came from our Architectural Review Board and Planning and Zoning Commission. Again, no project moves forward without City Council participation. At the end of the day, they authorize the funding, and they are the safety net, so to speak, in this process. But as you can see, the Planning and Zoning Commission worked on landscaping, location, the pedestrian network to serve it, the amenities associated with it. The Architectural Review Board considered the pavilion structure itself, the materials, the colors, the design, and even to a certain degree questioned the engineering with these large glue lam components. So again, I think if you see it in context in a photograph, it really doesn't do it justice in that setting, particularly on a fall or spring day, given the location that was selected near Bonham Creek. I haven't mentioned the Watershed Erosion Task Force because the Watershed Erosion Task Force wasn't in place at the time of these two projects. But I'd like to think that when we all work together, as I've shown on these two projects, great things happen in Wildwood, things that no other community can claim. The beauty of our pedestrian network, the bridges, the tunnels that you've all worked hard on, as well as city staff, and our parks and trail facilities. Again, just very successful. That's when it all works. And as part of your packet, you have a memorandum from the department that kind of gives you a very, very simplistic kind of chronology or hierarchy of the process, the steps in it. Mr. Newberry then created a flow chart that kind of gives you a very detailed description of the development process when a private owner or developer submits something to the city. So the attempt here at the direction of the chairs was to give you the background of what the process looks like so you can understand it and not be afraid of it, and certainly know where your role is in it at all times. And so with that, Dr. Remy, I'll conclude. I've said a lot in a short period of time, but if there are any questions or comments, Ms. Arnett, Mr. Newberry, and a litany of others on the screen can certainly respond to them. So thank you.
No, thank you, Mr. Bunich. So before we get to some questions, Joe, do we have the opportunity? I think you did a great job to describing process and a great example of how something worked really pretty well. Do we have an opportunity perhaps that Mr. Gunther can show little slides and we can just describe one of the impetuses behind why we wanted to meet together with something that perhaps didn't work so well? If we could allow him to, Mr. Gunther, are you available maybe to just show a couple slides? And Mr. Bunich, would you just mind giving just a quick background maybe of this project?
And certainly, and as chair, Dr. Remy, you can tell me what to do and I'll do my best. I can't run the 4-minute mile, but I'd sure try if you ask. So you're in charge, I guess is what I'm saying.
Mr. Gunther, are you available for slides? I can't see your face.
I believe he is. He was kind enough to send the slide presentation over early. Mr. Newberry will share screen. And if Mr. Gunther would unmute, we could begin that presentation. And while he's unmuting so he can participate, I don't want to necessarily pick on this project, but it is a project that's kind of brought into focus some of the issues any city faces. I want to first defend the Department of Public Works. When we submit grants, whether it's for a park, a trail, or some type of public works project, if we get money from an outside entity, they basically dictate terms to us. And those terms sometimes are very different than what you just saw in those two projects, so to speak. But it is a good example, and it's an example that we all can learn from. So I want to present this as a learning moment, not necessarily anybody at City Hall or anybody on any board, commission, or city council to the woodshed. So with that, Mr. Gunther, if you're ready, we can share screen.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you very much. This is well into the presentation. Can you go to slide 1, please? Okay, thank you. I think there's even one before this, but okay, all right. So anyway, we're just wanting to discuss. Sorry. Okay, we're wanting to discuss the new bridge replacement over Bonham Creek at Atherton Road here, and that's circled in the red. In the white ellipse there. So this is just an orientation you can see. All right, next slide, please. Another orientation, you can see how Atherton Road parallels to a certain degree Highway 109 to the west. And this road leads into the historic hamlet of Orville with a series of very beautiful historic buildings. And with that, we'll go to the next one. So in terms of the interconnectivity of everything, and in terms of the Architectural Review Board, I served on the Architectural Review Board for quite some time. It's important to understand the built environment, that this road and this bridge don't exist in isolation. So this is the old plat for the town of Orville. Go ahead. The red square is the historic school building. Go ahead. This is a view of what it looked like, probably late 1800s, 1890s, perhaps. Go ahead. And the historic school building, which is alongside the creek. All right. And with its addition off to the side, it's an L-shaped building now. Go ahead. And it also is a residence, by the way. The Hoppenberg Fix Store from 1867 is just up the hill, and it's a current residence. All right. And what we're seeing here is an aerial view that puts it all into context with the historic buildings along the east side of Old Atherton Road and Bonham Creek on either side. And the red dotted line represents the fact that with this project, the decision was made, well, first of all, it was decided to replace the bridge. Second of all, to widen the road. Third, to straighten out the road. And each one of those decisions has impacts. We went from an 18-foot wide pavement to 30 feet of pavement now. That's 166% increase in the cross section of the road, which will also add to stormwater with the impervious surface. Go ahead. I've been following this project for some time. The center line of the new bridge is actually on the left side of the original road. So that's how far out of alignment it is when it's widened, and when you straighten the road from one point to another over 800 feet. Basically, it pushes the road into the property owners to the east. Go ahead. Again, a view of the abutments being formed at the center line of the new road and bridge, positioned on the left side of the original road. Go ahead. The abutment being formed and the historic old school building, now a residence. Go ahead. And you can see the riprap that is alongside the shores on both sides of the creek. And you can see that the vegetation that was once there has all been removed. So now it's entirely riprap. Okay. And here's another view to see the impact of all of that riprap stone looking north towards the historic town of Orville and the schoolhouse. Go ahead. So one of the things in our task force we've learned, and we've actually put it into practice as a city, is how do we stabilize stream banks? And this happens to be at Cox Creek and a living wall that was built back in 2004. And it's circled in that red. Go ahead. We learned that it is improper to just dump riprap, as you see in this photograph. That's a do not do kind of a slide, okay? Rather, if you want to have a stabilized stream bank, you put in the larger stones at the bottom, smaller stones at the top, begin the planting so that you can stabilize that stream bank. Next slide. And with that, you can see off to the left, the vegetated bank. And so had you not known about the engineering that went into that stabilization of that stream bank off to the left, you wouldn't know because of the vegetation now. So it can be done, it can be engineered, and it can be properly done. And this is a view from 2008. So we know how to do this as a city. Go ahead. This is a view of the Bottom Creek in its natural state. Next slide. Next slide, please. But as the creek begins to bend around Etherton Road, to our surprise, it was riprap from one side to the other. Go ahead. Here is when the riprap was just on alongside the road with the red spray paint on the gravel bar across from it. Next slide. And there's the red spray paint again. So go ahead with the next slide. So the engineering drawings showed where the riprap was, I thought, supposed to be limited to in the yellow highlight. The blue represents the path of the stream, with the dotted line represented an altered path for the stream for Bottom Creek. Off to the left, you can see it all entirely riprapped now. Go ahead. And you can see this almost a before and after picture in one slide here, but you can see the beautiful natural state of the creek as it was, and then the additional riprap being placed in here, which tends to constrict the flow of the water. The water is sort of getting more stagnant now as this thing is going across. Go ahead. Note that tree that's on the bend there. Go ahead, next slide. The last weekend, we had quite a severe storm event, and you'll note the brush, the vegetation is laid over on its side, that red arrow from left to right. The stream found its own path. It went behind the riprap, pointed right at that tree, and that tree is no longer there. Go ahead. That tree is now east of the bridge, deposited right in the middle of the creek. The dotted line represents the height of the water as evidenced by the debris in the yard of the resident to the left. So quite a powerful storm event, and enough to take that tree out. Unfortunately, it had a lot of water being constricted and forced right at it there with all that new riprap. Go ahead. That's a close-up of that. That should be, we're gonna have to take care of that in order that this doesn't back up and cause future problems. Go ahead. This is a view of the construction, latest view as of a couple of days ago, leading up to the bridge, which is about 4 to 5 feet higher than the original road bed. Go ahead. A view of the bridge as it currently looks with the concrete walls on either side and the span. Okay. Of note, again, the original width of the road is shown off to the left. The bridge is not only centered on the eastern side of the old road, but it also was shifted to the east because of that straight line design. One questions what would have happened had we been able to reduce the width somewhat and follow the old road bed instead of putting it all into the front yard of our citizens' residence off to the right. Go ahead. You can see it's a massive bridge, quite wide, and again, additional pavement equals additional stormwater. Okay. This is a view of the connection between the Etherton Road as it exists further up and the bridge itself. And you can see the neighbor's house to the right. And next slide, please. And you can see how the road alignment or misalignment, I mean, it's trying to find its way back over to the 18-foot wide pavement up here. It's just kind of falling into the yards of the neighbors. And this is what it looks like as of a couple days ago. Go ahead. This is a view looking back at the bridge. You can see it's a much, much longer span. It's obviously much higher above the creek now, and you know, quite an engineering project. It's dramatically altered the ecology of the area as well as the architectural character of this site. Go ahead. These slides were animated before, so you could have seen the original roadbed. This is the new roadbed, and you can see it's 15 feet closer to the farmhouse, the schoolhouse building. Again, as due to that straight line effect. Okay. One of the questions, we know this bill, it's going to get completed as is, but one question I would like to raise even now is, do we have to continue the 4-foot wide shoulders for that 800-foot length, or can we reduce the pavement and try to neck this this road pavement down a little sooner? That's just a question, putting it out there. Go ahead. The other thing is there any way that the stream banks can possibly be revegetated as was shown in an earlier best practice slide from Cox Creek? Go ahead. This is a comparison of the original bridge, which you see in elevation above and in plan below. And the dotted line represents the old road width, and the more solid colors represent the new width of the bridge and the road. So you can see the different alignments and the dramatically much wider and longer bridge that we have now. Go ahead. I took it upon myself, that raised the question in my mind is, what are the clearances of various bridges around Wildwood? And so I took note of the bridge that we're talking about, also 109, Pond Road, and Woods Avenue. And taking measurements on all these, I found that they vary from one to the next in terms of how wide the bridges are between the concrete guard walls. The road widths vary, the drive lanes vary. So there tends not to be one absolute standard. It seems to be a bit more according to the site conditions. Go ahead. So with the bridge we've just been talking about, we'll go ahead and jump under the bridge. Next slide. We have now 10 feet of clearance underneath the concrete box beams to the water surface. So that is, that's what that looks like below. Go ahead. And interestingly, the closest bridge to it is upstream on Highway 109, which we drive over quite frequently. Go ahead to the next slide. And I was surprised to see when I got out and looked, the clearance here is actually 6 feet. Not 10 feet, but 6 feet between the concrete beam, bottom of beam, and the water. Go ahead. It's also 8 feet on the east side. So it actually, the road's sloping and slopes to drain. So, but this is the condition at 109, just so you know. I don't know if this backed up water this last weekend with the storm event or not. Go ahead, next slide. But here you can see, you know, the clearance is below as it exists today. Go ahead. So I raise all of these things, as Joe said very well. You know, this is offered in the spirit of how do we go forward in terms of planning, making key strategic decisions, communicating with each other about how can we all work together so that we don't, you know, have similar results in the future, because I believe we have some more bridge replacements coming up. So how can we have bridges that relate to the width of the roads that they're aligning with? We have a lot of wonderful country roads that are about 18 feet in width. Can we keep our bridges narrower and a little bit more charming, or not? And also architecturally, this happened to be a case where it was right next to and leading into this beautiful historic district that we have. And so Architectural Review Board, I could see having had input on this project. I don't know if they were invited to or not, but it would have been good to try to understand the impact of all of this work relative to the historic character of that area and that bridge coming in. So with that, I'll be quiet. Offer up any questions and answers.
Thank you, Mr. Gunther. And just to piggyback on what you just eloquently just said, I think you've highlighted and certainly underscored the magnitude by which I think the three groups would benefit from that cooperation, because I think individual projects that may meet the current code for the state or the county regulations or meet MSD requirements may certainly not take into account a lot of the things that we've learned thus far from the task force about how the interconnectedness of these watersheds are, and something that seems distal from a certain area that has high erosion may in fact actually be quite relevant. And until we really evaluate this with some of the information that we've learned thus far from the task force, and actually information that we've known for years, I think we're going to be faced with these problems, especially if we're not working in unison to be able to try to quell some of the erosion issues and watershed problems that we've unearthed over the past year and a half. So with that, Mr. Vunich or Mr. Newberry, are there any questions for Mr. Gunther or any general statements?
Well, Dr. Remy, I'll defer to Ms. Arnett, Mr. Newberry to see if there's any hand raising, or if there is someone that's made a motion on their screen to make a comment or ask a question.
It looks like Mr. Brown, you've got a comment. Would you like to speak?
I appreciate this. I didn't know that we were going to talk specifically about this project. Otherwise, I would have been glad to put together a presentation, which I think would have been much more helpful. And I will offer to do that if you'd like to go through the project in more detail, say at a future meeting of the Erosion Task Force. There's a lot of details that go into a project, designing a project like this. There's no cookie cutter approach. We design things to meet the conditions that we're faced with. We worked on this project for a good 5 years on the capital improvements program in 2015. It was basically designed in 2015 to 2018. And at that point, we negotiated with the property owners, including Mr. Irvin, who you referenced in the presentation, for easements. And so there's a great deal of involvement with those property owners to address their concerns. Council member Greg Nani at the time was very involved. He sat in with meetings with Mr. Irvin, talked about his project, his site specifically. And both council members at that time were aware and involved in the project and understood the constraints that we felt that we were faced with on the engineering side, the criteria that we have to meet, such as providing a facility that does meet the requirements of MoDOT, of MSD, of our own criteria as well. So they were very involved at that time, and I think understood the issues we face. There is no perfect project. We do our best, and there's trade-offs with every project that you build. There's trade-offs and nothing is perfect. So nothing is always the way we'd like them to be. We try to optimize everything we do, and we'll say that. As far as construction, I feel like I'm being judged before the final exam, quite frankly. The project's not finished, folks. It's getting close, but it's not finished. Every project looks disruptful during construction. I know that many of you probably all drove 109 when we did the project there. When you were going through it every day, it looks terrible, but when it's finished, it looks 100% better, and we will look much better this fall when that project is done. And over the time, when Mother Nature overtakes and returns, it'll look much better as well. So it looks terrible now, it looks very impactful, but believe me, our park projects, when they were being built, were the same way. City Hall was the same way. They always look terrible under construction. So again, I feel like we're being judged before we had the chance to take the final exam. We have a lot of work left to do. We do plan to live stake the slopes of the creek, revegetate those slopes. So that is in the works, but that work will not happen till this winter time when it's ideal. But I know you referenced previous projects, but I bet if you went to those projects while they were under construction or soon after completion, they would look very much the same. I think it's unfair to judge it from its appearance right now. We can certainly talk further about our approach to stream bank erosion, but I will tell you the engineering effort, one of the main tenets of that is a hydraulic analysis. And that hydraulic analysis drives the design of the project. It drives the size, the location of the bridge, the length of the bridge, and the height of that bridge. And that hydraulic analysis encompasses a mile of stream. It looks a half a mile upstream, a half a mile downstream. So it's not a quick glance at the stream at that location. It's very comprehensive. And the engineers take it very seriously from a liability standpoint. They are always concerned about negative impacts to their projects. It's A number one, absolutely A number one. Documentation is very important because they want to be able to defend themselves a year, 2 years down the road, 10 years down the road if a concern comes up. So those hydraulic analysis are the basis of the design of the structure combined with the criteria that we have to meet. And then, by the way, it's not just federal criteria, it's not just state criteria, it's Wildwood criteria. We participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. If you're not aware of what that encompasses, it means that it allows our residents to buy flood insurance if they live adjacent to the creeks at a reasonable rate. But in exchange for the program, we have to regulate our floodplains. And Joe knows all about this. We have regulations, we have city ordinances that regulate the floodplains that apply to our structures, and we also apply it to private residents. When they want to build adjacent or on a floodplain, they have to build their homes above the 100-year flood elevation. We require it of private residences, and we require it of ourselves. When we build a bridge, we place that bridge above the 100-year flood elevation. Now that is, when I say 100-year storm, just to be clear, a 100-year storm, we reference that means it has a 1 in 100 chance or probability in any given year of occurring. That's a magnitude of storm event designed in large part for a 100-year storm, 1 in 100 chance in any given year of occurrence. But that's why the bridge is located from an elevation perspective, how it's set. It's designed to be the lowest chord or lowest girder elevation at the 100-year flood elevation. And that's fairly consistent with our bridges in Wildwood. There may be some exceptions out there. As I said, every project is unique. We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We do our best to meet the conditions of that site, of that location that we're impacting. But we have to consider the users of the road, bikes, pedestrians, cars. We have to consider the impacts to the property owners adjacent to that route. We need to consider the environment, obviously. We have environmental regulations we have to follow. And we need to consider the overall goals of the city, obviously, as well. So there's a lot of constraints that we have to deal with when we design a project. We do the very best that we can at any given time. I certainly agree that a multidisciplined approach is a positive thing for most projects. The more input we get, the better. We can always do better, and we can always strive to do better. We should always strive to do better. As far as the width of the road and the use of shoulders, again, we have to design for cars, bikes, pedestrians. I can make a pretty good argument that from ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, we should put shoulders on our bridges so that folks can walk across those bridges. By the way, if you've been on a bridge as a pedestrian with no shoulders, two cars.
Excuse me, this is Dave Dial. Can I interrupt?
That's fine.
Sure.
This meeting has apparently been hijacked. I did not in the pre-meeting even know we were going to be talking about one specific project or any specific projects. Frankly, that's not what this meeting is about. The slideshow, not what this meeting was supposed to be about. I don't know how we got off onto that topic. And Mr. Brown, I totally understand your feelings and your comments, and I didn't mean to interrupt for any negative reason, but we need to discuss how to do what the meeting was supposed to be about, which is how to all come together. So if we can forget about that bridge and move on and talk about how to work together as a team in the future, that would shorten this meeting and get to the point.
Yeah, Mr. Dow, I'm gonna agree with you and disagree with you, and I'll explain. We actually did talk about this project, and that was in part why we had that pre-meeting. And we're actually not going to talk about this project in depth. That wasn't the intent. It was supposed to be an illustrative example of an opportunity of how we perhaps can reframe the way that we do work together. I do think that Mr. Brown highlighted a number of different areas that I think we should really consider. And one of them is specifically that we've got unique landscapes specifically in this city with all of the different watersheds, and certainly the hydraulic plan for a mile upstream, downstream makes a lot of sense for a lot of different building and meeting the code and recommendations. But I think that it provides us a unique opportunity that we really need to step back and say, do we need to, as a city, evaluate all the individual requirements for a building project and then step back and look into what is the impact upon our erosion watershed plains? Because perhaps we're not doing that as well as we could be doing that. And this, I think, is just an illustrative example of something obviously that happened well before the Erosion Task Force, but is a perfect example of, well, what can we do? Now, we could certainly develop a liaison program between the Erosion Task Force and the Architectural Board and the P&Z, but I think we might even want to take a deeper dive, which is, should we really evaluate our current ordinances and evaluate project development in the lens of our unique Wildwood landscape? So I don't know how to do that. And I'd love to hear what your suggestions might be from the Architectural Board, how you suggest we approach that.
I think one easy suggestion, not into the depth of rewriting ordinances and that sort of thing, would be for, I didn't even know about this bridge. I drive by 109 all the time, but I didn't drive up there and look at it. So that is a bad thing. Maybe we should all know about it. But like we talked in our pre-meeting, if the chair of each board, or whatever you call them, if the chair of each one received notice of every single project going on, even if just an email, nothing formal, no liaisons to all the meetings, but just an email so that we know what's going on, and then that chair could decide for his group whether that group should have some say or even has a recommendation, unofficial even. If ARB shouldn't comment on engineering, but maybe like George Crow always has very good comments on, he's an ARB member, he always has good comments on constructability and that sort of thing. So the idea that the chairs get the notification and can bring it to their board if necessary, or say, this doesn't really even apply, I think that would be a great starting point.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Just Mr. Rambo.
Yeah, I think the Public Works Department built us a great, safe bridge. I think we may have lost sight of the ball in terms of the surrounding area. There's an aesthetic cost to this bridge that seems excessive. We might not have had to make it quite so straight or quite so wide or something like that. But the real central point is, I think we may often lose sight of the aesthetics of a particular project. We make the structure itself look beautiful, but we don't step back 500 feet and look at the overall surrounding area and what it's impacting necessarily. And along with that is the whole the bank, the reseeding and replanting of the bank and the riprap and so on and so forth. I think if we need to figure out how to do a better job with that from an environmental perspective, and it can all be under the auspices of Public Works after we get our act together. But I think we do need some sort of guidelines, if not ordinances, to take all those things into account. I just don't know how to do it.
Mr. Newberry, would you mind just putting back up the schema that you had for just a generalized project as brought before I believe, for the city. And I'd just love to put that back on the screen for one moment. And if it's okay with Chair Lee, when a project comes obviously before planning and zoning and meets the criteria to be approved, where in this stage do you think that we would want to at least have an analysis of the impact perhaps on the stormwater drainage and flood and erosion issues, at least as best as we understand from the information that we've been provided by Dr. David Hammer in understanding the current state of our erosion problems? Where do you think that that could fit in? And is there an opportunity for us either as the erosion committee or with one of our consultants maybe to just provide some expert opinion on perhaps direct impact?
Go ahead. I'm off mute. So you see that box that says site development plan submitted? That is the first schematic engineering plan that would come into the city of Wildwood, and that is where you would have your comments. Up and before that, it's just basically ordinance and use and basic layout. So there wouldn't be anything to review. You would review it at the site development plan.
And Mr. Dow, where do you think that, so that would be the same location and then you would get it a bit downstream from there. And so maybe we would have a follow-up evaluation in your staging there. Would that make sense to you?
Yes, just somewhere in the near beginning stages, just so that every committee gets an eye on it.
Mm-hmm.
What we've been trying to do with ARB, since I'm sit on that as well as a liaison, is to get the architectural review board to comment on the aesthetics of it up front, and we get that input with Joe's report that he puts together, and that's been very helpful. The infancy of the project, if we can get ARB's opinions in there, we get a better project, and that goes with, you know, the bridge, the aesthetic of the bridge. How does it fit in the site? You know, I'm just use the bridge as an example, but if we did a development, it would be, you know, the road, street development and things like that. The problem that we have, I think, is not, you know, Rick Brown was defending the civil engineering. Well, that's going to happen. That's what civil engineers do. And I totally understand where he's coming from here. What we have is more of a construction issue with a lot of our sites. If you look at villages of Brightleaf, they went out there and bulldozed a whole lot of trees that they weren't supposed to. And then they said, oh, I'm sorry. So, you know, that's the kind of thing that happens. And
Mr. Lee, they didn't.
Yeah. Oh, they didn't? They just took down the vegetation?
No.
Okay.
The neighbors have continued to say that they have, but between Mr. Brown, Mr. Gramlich, Mr. Laughlin, our two code enforcement officers, and I, we've covered that site multiple times.
So the tree line's good. I'll just retract that statement. But what happens a lot in construction is you're under a schedule. You have to do things. You know, Rick said the bridge isn't finished. The riprap obviously isn't finished. So once things, you have to look at things when they're finished. That's very critical to this, you know, and how we go back. It's easy to, you know, be the 19th hole, you know, looking at the golf round, but you have to be in the game to do it. So I think they need to let this bridge project go and come to completion, and then you'd have a different impact. Joe, one thing I would like to mention on the bridges just in general was we had a lot of water problems where the bridges that we had in Wildwood were choke points. And we had a lot of debris collecting, and a lot of the design and improvements for the bridges was to resolve that problem. So we're not just replacing bridges because we want to. There's an issue here that we're trying to resolve. And I think it's an engineering thing. It's something that we should review during site plan, the site development plan, which then sets the criteria for the construction drawings. And it's the construction drawings where you catch things like this.
Just,
And I'll-
just out of curiosity, and I want to make sure we all understand the focus of this meeting is certainly not the bridge, is going, when you evaluate these projects and then they go into construction and are completed, in the pre-construction period during the development and going to P&Z and Architectural Board, in the plans, does it also include a post-construction evaluation of impact so that if the intended, or at least the review process demonstrates that we believe that this is in line with meeting all the criteria necessary ordinances as delineated by the different entities, and it meets all those criteria, and we believe that this is going to have appropriate runoff and drainage, etc. But what sort of evaluation is upon either the builder, the construction company post project, and is that something also we should evaluate? Is a 2 or 5 year, just to make sure that we're getting it right?
That's
I know-
not part of P and Z, so that would be, Rick, I'll turn it over to you on that one.
You know, that is an interesting suggestion, and I don't know that we do that enough, frankly, but that is certainly a good idea, and I would not discourage that either. You know, you can always learn, and you should learn from projects, learn from things that didn't go as well, or in some cases, things do go very well. And either way, those are good lessons learned. So, you know, if there's a way to structure that and make it more a formal part of our processes, that's probably not a bad idea.
Councilmember Rabad, I think you have the next question or statement. You're up
Me?
next. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to make it clear that I think that if the site development plan is the first place that we look at this, new folks looking at it will make different judgments, and we really need to codify the criteria by which we're evaluating these projects. And again, I'm going back to the I understand the need to keep root wads from hanging up underneath our brand new bridge and so forth. Those are engineering problems, but we can specify, you know, some sort of minimum width for the traffic and whatnot, and probably get past that. But the again, the aesthetics and the environmental impact and the erosion reduction function of riprap and so on and so forth. I really think we can do a better job with that. And so I'm lobbying again, I guess, for you know, some method for codification of the judgment criteria that's above and beyond the aesthetics of the structure itself. That's all.
Thank you. Councilmember Clark.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. You know, I think by offering all of the projects to all of the groups to review in a initial planning stage will give us like full transparency and offer to build a mitigation plan, to build a control plan. So before we even go to the planning stage of getting the construction involved and how we're going to build it and all the details and the measurements and everything involved, when we're planning, we're in the initiation phase and we're planning this. I think getting the people in, getting all of our groups involved and to input all of the things, you know, having that as our criteria, like Dr. Rembo was saying, we have these criteria that we're going to meet, and we each know what we want or what we, our expertise, and input that. Maybe we don't have anything for the control plan. Maybe we're fine with everything that's going to happen. But without that, without having that plan ahead of time, we're going to run into issues, and it's going to set us back, and then we're going to have to change our timing, and we're going to be spending more money in the long run. So we need to do it ahead of time and plan go through our risk analysis before we get to the point where we are building.
Thank you. So I have a procedural question that I'm going to go to Mr. Bortelsmeyer. procedural question for Mr. Brown, Mr. Vunich, and Ms. Arnett would be, is it possible for us to have a non-voting liaison member of the erosion task force on both the ARB and P&Z, number one, and then and how would we go about that? Would that be done tonight with a motion perhaps, or that would have to be voted by city council? And then the second question is a follow-up, which would be in our erosion task force with Mr. Archesky's permission, we could put an agenda item on for the end of the month where I would almost consider creating a subcommittee just for review of new projects, and those members of the erosion task force, their duty would actually be to take a look at all projects that are coming before those groups, and then could bring our insights, at least from the erosion task force, to the liaison if that's allowed.
Well, I can attempt to answer a part of the question. By the Watershed Erosion Task Force is not a standing committee, board, or commission. And so you, as members of that task force, were formed to kind of analyze a problem, create solutions, and then kind of leave those solutions to others. I think the first step for you all to be part of any board, commission, or committee would be to have the Watershed Erosion Task Force become a standing entity here in the city, just as the commission, the Architectural Review Board, etc. And that would require council action and mayor support.
Joe, but couldn't we just make recommendations?
Certainly, at the end of the day, a liaison or a non-voting member is there to participate in the discussion and the recommendation. Other than the Architectural Review Board, almost everything goes to City Council where it belongs for final action. And so, yes, to answer your question, yes.
Mr. Bartlesmeyer.
I'm like, if I think I saw someone else with their hand up, if they want to discuss this topic, I had a different topic. So if someone else wants to go before me to stay on topic, that's perfectly fine.
Councilmember Dadwell.
Just real quickly, I wanted to propose potentially the ability to, I like the idea that we have the erosion task force, but perhaps out of that task force, we put together the guidelines that need to be applied by P&Z, by architectural review, etc., in each of those groups. So as they're doing their evaluative process, they take into account the fact that, yes, there could be a potential erosion problem. Perhaps we should do a layered approach for riprap when we're approving a particular project out of P&Z. Perhaps in this particular area, we need to look at the design of the bridge so it doesn't impact the architectural quality of the buildings that are going to be supported around it. I think the Watershed Task Force is doing a terrific job, but I'd like to have them as part of their current goals to develop what each of these subcommittees should be doing as part of their routine job. They look at power, they look at the shingles on a roof, they look at the street layout, etc. They need to take the watershed just as seriously in that whole process as they're developing that. So that was just my suggestion.
No, thank you. So I'm going to go to Councilmember Rambo, then Edens, and then Mr. Bartlesmeyer. And if anyone else doesn't have any questions at that point, maybe we just come up with a couple actionable items at the end of this convened meeting, and then revisit this in the future. Just with, we've been at about an hour and 5 minutes on this meeting, so I want to not keep everybody too long, but we can come out with some tangibles at the end. So Councilmember Rambo.
I can completely agree with Councilmember Dodwell. That's a critical point that she made. It was one of the 2 points I was going to make, but the other one is if we're going to change the the WETF into some, standing committee, maybe we should consider broadening it to a general environmental kind of review with the native plantings and how to best, and most naturally restore the stream banks and so on and so forth. Because there's a lot to that, and that's why that's frankly one of my major concerns when I was talking about different people will make different judgments. Maybe if it's a broader standing committee, there'll be institutional knowledge and documents and so on and so forth. I don't want to get us into the mode of every committee needs to review every project multiple times and whatnot. Shoot, somebody else made this point. To Councilmember Clark's point, we could wind up causing ourselves more problems than we solve. That's my feeling.
Commissioner Helfrey, and then Ms. Edens.
Well, I will wait till next time. Thank you, though.
Okay, Councilmember Edens.
Just a quick tangible that maybe could come out of this. Focusing on the future is great, but what I'm hearing and learned too is that there might be some past information that would be very helpful to the Creek Erosion Task Force, but also to our independent consultant, Dr. Hammer, and that's that we have consistently done for our engineering projects, especially in an effort to receive grant funding, hydrology reports. And this could give us a good picture of what has changed over time in Wildwood and add to the information that we have as a whole if we put it together rather than having it siloed in different departments. So I think it would be helpful to have any information that Public Works has kind of shared with the task force. And certainly we would like you to look at the information that the Dr. Hammer has collected as well. But that's much more valuable than just looking at, Google Earth images from 10 years ago and other things that the city has done. So I would be interested in even seeing some of that myself. So thanks.
That's a great idea, Councilmember Edens, and I think we should definitely move forward to doing such.
Dr. Remy,
yes, sir.
Sorry I was late. Anyway, going to Councilman Dodwell's question, part of this committee is to create, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, is a stormwater master plan, which would take in a lot of those accounts of what needs to be looked at before projects are done. Is that, we talked about that, correct, Joe?
Yes, a number of the subcommittees have identified as a future project, a stormwater master plan for the city of Wildwood.
In addition, with the Corps, and I kind of instigated this years ago, we had a checklist and it went through all the departments that may have some kind of applicability to it. And so it was just a checklist that went through and it checked off. In our case, it's mostly environmental stuff. We went through cultural. Maybe something the city might want to put together, just send it through. And then if you see that there's a problem, then you can go out and check those particular instances where you think there's a problem, whether it's environmental, cultural, or some other thing.
It's a great idea. Councilmember Garitano.
Yeah, thank you for setting up the meeting here. I've been really listening here to the conversation and could agree with a lot of the comments here. Mr. Brown brought up about projects that while they are underway, they do not look as great until they finally get completed. And it's very true of subdivisions. And so a lot of times folks are seeing what's happening and reacting to that moment there. But there is a lot of truth to that. But continuing with what Mr. Archesky said tonight, this is exactly what I was thinking. And as you mentioned, perhaps having a member of Watershed Erosion Task Force or some kind of representation on other committees, perhaps the best solution is that once we're able to strategically set some guidelines or policy that addresses watershed erosion and be able to incorporate that as we look at future plans, that will prevent the watershed issues that we have. Maybe in the meantime, it might have to be a more tactical approach to have that kind of cross-representation, if it is possible or not. But I think in the future, if we set the policy, the guidelines, just like Mr. Marcheski said, I think he called it the kind of like a watershed erosion master plan. I think those will be the guidelines that we can live by, and hopefully they will guide our city in the future. So that's where I think I'd like to see us go there.
Mr. Bartlesmeyer.
It's all right. I rescind my discussion comment. I think for the most part it's been answered or discussed, so it's all right.
So without any objection, if there, oh, sorry, Mr. Sturman.
Yeah, I have just one question for especially Mr. Brown. I did some checking into prior to that flow chart you put up, what the city already does. And it seemed very thorough process to include speaking to people who live in the area. And so, first of all, the bridge was higher, it's wider, and everything has been straightened. And I guess, first of all, I'm just curious to know how many aspects of that design was beyond and above the city's control when you checked into satisfying all the various governing agencies and their codes and regulations. And so what I'm saying is, I'm wondering if a whole lot of this aspects of the design, we won't have as much freedom as maybe we like to have in dictating and establishing the final design. I'd like to hear from you, Mr. Brown, on that one.
Well, I think I would tend to agree as far as the actual design of the bridge and the width of the bridge, the length of the bridge. A lot of those features are dictated by engineering practice, by criteria that we have to follow, by criteria that the city has adopted itself. So certainly we could look to adopt some unique criteria that might give us more wiggle room in some situations, perhaps. But Joe referenced the federal funding aspect. When we get federal funds, and we do this frequently, we do commit to following MoDOT standards for those projects. So that invites MoDOT's review of our design. And those are the things that they do check is the lane width, the shoulder width, and those kind of things. So I suspect there definitely would be some limits to how far you can go with it. I think one of the things that Public Works struggles with is just the overall goal with regard to aesthetics on a project, and specifically a bridge. How much money do we want to put into the aesthetics for a bridge structure itself? And frankly, if we want to spend additional monies on landscaping, we haven't typically done that, at least to my knowledge, on rural type projects to any large extent, but we could. So those things would certainly have some value to get an idea. Do we want to add to the budget 10% for additional landscaping if it's possible? But you got to keep in mind, we don't go out and buy extra land for these projects. So we don't have room to go out and landscape without doing it in someone's front yard, frankly. So there's not a lot of opportunity to do a lot of that stuff that might seem like a really great idea. Now, what we can do is pull in landscape architects in a greater degree maybe than we have in the past to help guide us. And on Eston Road, we brought in Ken Keitel, and I think many of you know Ken, help us primarily with Andy Irvin's property and the landscape plan that we developed, which you haven't totally seen yet. So I think there is an opportunity for us to pull in a landscape architect as a routine rather than an unusual situation, but make that a routine of part of a project. And specifically getting better guidance on what we want to do with regard to bridge aesthetics and how much we might want to spend on that. We have, as you know, recently done that on the 109 bridge over 100. We spent some money there. I think most people support it, but every now and then you get a comment that it's not a good use of taxpayer monies. So better input in that regard would certainly be helpful, I think, from Public Works perspective.
Okay, so we're about an hour and 15 minutes into this meeting, and I think I'll move on to just some summary comments and offer to the three co-chairs to make comments as well. But from the Erosion Task Force, I'm hoping that one of our tangibles and actionable items that we'll include in our agenda, Mr. Vunich and Ms. Arnett, if we could do such, is to add on a piece about at least having an Erosion Task Force subcommittee group to review a lot of the prospective projects and at least offer some general recommendations to the two other groups as we move forward. And then we could talk about logistics at that time, at that meeting, about possibilities to see how we could better improve, whether it's a liaison position or moving towards a standing committee at that point, as we work towards development over the next year for that master plan. So that's what I'm hoping from the Erosion Task Force side. And when Mr. Archesky's got more to say for that, I'll open it up to him.
No, that sounds good. I'll let some of the other chairmen talk.
Mr. Lee.
Generally, I think it's a good idea. We get some input like this up front. Getting a report for a master plan, erosion plan would be a good thing as far as any development. Again, that's something that would change based on any development coming in. You know, would have to be updated all the time. So as you develop in one area, you impact another area. That's what we have going on in Wildwood. And Rick's got some good ideas as far as creating that. I think you push that through. It's not really a planning and zoning thing though. I mean, what we are trying to do is compliance to ordinance or deviation to ordinance if it makes sense. Those are the two critical things that we do. As far as what you guys are talking about is the engineering behind it and how that's done, whether it's effective or not. So I think it becomes a criteria, like I said, for a site development plan review, construction drawings review. And if you're going to do this correctly, you're going to need civil engineers on this committee to do this effectively. This is not an opinion based thing. This is engineering design, and Rick Brown can go way into this, but it's upstream, downstream. There's all sorts of components on this, and there are experts out there that develop stream banks and so forth as far as engineering behind that. So there's a lot of avenues that we can push if there are concerns. I think the committee brings that forth. Joe can bring that up in the presentations, and then we can start it at that point for the discussion.
Thank you. Mr. Dial.
Sorry, I was muted. As far as the ARB goes, we don't spend time in the ARB meetings discussing landscaping or erosion or things of that matter. So a liaison to that, I know that was brought up earlier, I think would be a waste of that person's time. Although anyone is always welcome to attend the ARB meetings and comment all they want. As far as having a committee or making the erosion control board a permanent board, that's certainly not up to me or the architects or any one committee. Not a bad idea for everyone to know what's going on at all the time, though. That's really, I think, the key to this, without having a lot more regulations put in place and requirements and committees. That's my opinion.
Mr. Vunich, Mr. Brown, Ms. Arnett, or Mr. Newberry, anything from you as from the city?
Well, I'll defer to those three before I close. How's that?
Well played.
I don't have anything further, but again, if you desire to talk more about the specifics of the Atherton Bridge, I'll be glad to do that at a subsequent meeting. We can go through in more detail how we come up with essentially the geometric features of the project.
I don't have anything else to add. I'm the biggest talker in the building, so communication is always in my wheelhouse, and I'm happy to do whatever we can as staff to assist with that. So I'll let Mr. Vunich close, or Mr. Newberry.
I don't have anything to add.
Well, to the different members and et cetera of the three boards. I think the summary that I leave the meeting with is as follows. That from a standpoint of the Erosion Task Force, they would like to form a subcommittee of themselves to assist in the review of plans, whether it be a private or public project. That one of the key components out of the Watershed Erosion Task Force may be a stormwater master plan, similar to our master plan, that will provide guidance for not only the current projects, but those that follow. And then I think the overarching comment out of almost everybody that spoke is that the sooner a board, commission, committee, or task force can be involved in the process, the better. It will save time in the long run and make the project improved. And so those are the takeaways I have. As we go back to our individual boards, commissions, and committees and task force, the department will provide those key points to them, and then those individuals that form those entities can take them up and provide input, and then we can maybe get back together and see where we are at some point in the future this fall. And with that, I do want to again thank you all for your time. I know it's an imposition, and it's not always the easiest thing to sit and listen. And so we do appreciate it very much, and we can't do our jobs without you.
Thank you, Mr. Vunich, and thank everyone for joining. I wanted to be clear that we're most appreciative of the work of our city employees and everybody that's here on this call today. And I think this is at least a good first step for us to have ongoing communication. And with that, I'll see if there's a motion for adjournment. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Before we do that, Mr. Newberry mentioned that we have public comment section. Are there any public comment cards for today that we neglected?
Mr. Chair, there are 7 in attendance. I just wanted to bring that to your attention, that there are, and if they would like to make a comment as part of the agenda, they could just raise their hand on Zoom or put something in chat, and we'll give them a few moments to do so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Newberry, anything?
No, sir.
Okay, well, with that, we'll ascertain a motion for adjournment. Do we have a motion for adjournment?
So moved.
By Mr. Sturman, seconded by Councilmember Rambo. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Meeting's adjourned. Everyone have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank
Get out
you.
of the street,
All of you.
Kathy, you're getting hit by a car.
I gotta be more careful.